here yesterday for our fabulous retreat in the afternoon on the prayer book, and some of you were not, and so for that reason, it's my pleasure to introduce Derek Olson, who is with us, who has written a fabulous book on the prayer book, which we're going to be spending some time with in the season of Lent. And yesterday he took us through an overview, a broad fly-through, liturgical spirituality. What does it mean that we, as Episcopalians, have a liturgical sensibility, that the liturgy is part of our spiritual life, and then how we mark time with that, and then how it expresses itself particularly in what we call the daily office, like morning and evening prayer, and the Eucharist. So yesterday was fabulous, and this morning, in this slot, Derek's going to talk about why and how we actually wound up with the prayer book, because I think sometimes that's a question we've all got theories about, but it's kind of hard to pin down in a conclusive kind of way. So we're hoping he'll help us with that. And then, of course, after the service this morning at 10, we'll be back here for a lunch and learn that's going to be about keeping Lent with the prayer book. So if you are wanting more, that's another opportunity while we've got Derek with us. So feel free to give a warm and daylight savings welcome to Derek Olson this morning.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Had great fun yesterday. Looking forward to speaking with you today as well. All right, so why the prayer book? Then and now. I'm going to talk more, and the slides are going to be more on then, which means that we can converse more about now once the slides are done. This is material that I'm kind of playing with and that I'm pulling together. It may become a book after the one I have due now gets finished. So we'll see. But it's an interesting question. Why do we have? The prayer book is not an inevitability, right? Why did this particular bunch of Christians decide on a prayer book as a thing to guide us and to keep us together, and then why is it that we keep using one? So just to get some basic facts down, so let's remember sort of what some of our other options could be. So at the time of the Reformation, so in the early 1500s, when you have sort of a broad revolt against the Catholic Church in the West, on both the continent and then later in England, different forms of material came out around which people would organize themselves. So on the continent, it was chiefly in terms of confessions and catechisms. So we have the Heidelberg Catechism, we have the Augsburg Confession, we have Luther's large and small catechisms. All right, so these are writings about thinking, right? They're writings about thought. What is it that we say that we believe? And how is it that we teach one another what it is that we think that they ought to think? The Church of England, though, produced something different. So in 1549, that's when we produced the first Book of Common Prayer. And then there was a second edition in 1552. So the first one was at the very beginning of the reign of Edward VI, and then the second one was shortly thereafter. Then we had Mary, who comes to the throne, and she takes England back in a Roman Catholic direction. And then once Mary leaves the throne and Elizabeth comes on, then we have the third edition, the 1559 Book of Common Prayer. And so that book then, the Elizabethan prayer book, sort of sets the standard for what's going to come for many hundreds of years. So while 1549 is the first one, 1559 is kind of the most important in terms of long-term continuity for how we do what we do. Now, we have the 39 articles. And in some sense, the 39 articles are kind of like what we see on the continent, that this is a set of things that we say that we think and that we say that other people ought to think too. But these didn't actually come out until 1571, so rather late in the process. If you want to think chronologically, Henry VIII makes his formal break with the Roman Catholic Church in 1535, and so these don't come out until, almost 50 years later. And what makes the 39 Articles official is that they get printed in the prayer book. So again, it's the prayer book that is the central focus. Right? Well, but why? Why is it that we decided to go with this instead of something that looked more like that? Why was England so different? First, one of the reasons is in terms of political geography. So England was in a different place than the continental powers in terms of the way that power and authority was structured. In terms of the German areas, the Swiss areas, these were largely areas where cities and their councils had a great deal of power. You had princes, certainly, and you had princes of various areas, but you didn't have a reigning monarch in the same sort of way. Instead, you would have leagues, you'd have groups of folks who were working together, who would then elect leaders of territories. England, however, was different. You very much had a king. He was very much the monarch of England. Not Scotland, but certainly Wales and Britain itself. At this point, they'd pretty much given up most of their pretensions in France. And so England was itself its own thing with its own political polity. So you had a centralized monarchy, but you still also had powerful regional lords, but in a different way than what we see on the continent. So there was also a diversity of opinion amongst the English nobility and religious leaders. Not all of them were exactly sure what was going on and if they wanted to, what sort of separation they wanted to make from the Roman Catholic Church. And let's not forget that chief amongst these was Henry VIII. So Henry VIII is known for kicking off our Reformation, but let's not forget this is the same Henry VIII. So of the various titles that the kings of England possess, one of them is Defensor Fidei, Defender of the Faith, which was given by the Pope to Henry VIII because of a treatise that he wrote against Luther in the 1520s. So Henry himself is sort of an interesting figure here and an interesting person to be the head of a Reformation of this kind. Henry actually was very conservative theologically. He was not interested terribly in a theological Reformation. He was interested in a political Reformation. So instead of allowing a pope far away who has ties to other political powers making decisions about who his bishops ought to be, he said, no, I'm the King of England. I ought to be the one to make these decisions, just like my predecessors before me have historically done in the past. And so his beef wasn't as much with the theology as it was with the way that the political apparatus of the church was being structured. However, there were some nobility who were very interested in the Reformation ideas that were coming from the continent. And then you had some others who were very staunch Roman Catholics. And so there was a disparity of belief amongst the nobility. But unlike in Europe, on the continent, they could sort of negotiate in eos regio, eos religio. So whoever owns the territory can pick the religion, essentially. Well, that wouldn't work in England, because you did have a strong central government, but then also you've got the monarchy depends on these other lords playing along. So how to get everyone to play nice? So the safest course for the crown was not to enforce a system of official belief. So not official declarations of what it is that you have to think. Instead, to prescribe what is done in public. How are we acting together? So this is where Elizabeth is credited with a line about not making windows into men's souls. The whole point of that is that's for everyone's safety. That's so that we don't have to go after what it is that you might think. Instead, let's focus on what it is that we do in public. So, worship is a public communal action. Right? You can believe whatever you like to believe. You can even do whatever it is that you want to do in private, but you must conform to these particular corporate practices. And as a result, the Book of Common Prayer then was a way to establish conformity. That we're all going to do these things, and we're even not going to be terribly specific about how you interpret these. As long as you do these things, then you're going to be in the clear. So it was a way to negotiate the complexity of the wide spectrum of belief among the English lords. All right, so where did this book come from? Or where did it arise from? Well, we get told a few different things on this. The standard conventional narrative that you're going to hear is that the Book of Common Prayer, Thomas Cranbrook, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and a group of his friends sat down and decided that they would take the books that belonged to the clergy, so the Missal and the Breviary, and they would kind of cut those down and simplify them, and then graciously give them to the laity. All right, so that's kind of the standard narrative that we tend to hear. I'm going to give you a slightly different narrative. I'd like to start with why a book, why a prayer book? And the place where I'm going to start is that the chief devotional object of choice used in Northern Europe for centuries was a book. So you see this in France, in the Low Countries, in England, that praying from a book was an important part of their religious practice. So monastic spirituality was a major influence on lay spirituality, particularly in these countries. And at the heart of monastic practice was praying the Psalter. So praying through the Psalms. You know, going through all 150 Psalms every week, frequently certain Psalms more than that. In Lent, in your typical English monastery, you would pray Psalm 51 7 different times. That's in addition to all the other Psalms that you were going to be singing that particular day. All right. So the sanctoral and the temporal calendars that guided monastic life then filtered into lay life. So praying the 7 offices of the breviary, 7 plus 1. So again, this emphasis on the Psalms, repetition of that, and then also daily Eucharist. All right, so for the literate, and usually the literate were nobles, not always, but usually, Psalters then were the first devotional books. And so sometimes they would receive these from monastic friends. And this begins happening at a very early time period. So here's a Psalter that was owned by a nobleman. This is the Paris Psalter. And one of the interesting things about this is it's a bilingual Psalter. So this column here is in Latin. This column is in Old English. All right? And so we actually had bits and pieces of the Bible translated into Old English at the point just before the Norman conquest. So the Gospels were translated in English. We had paraphrases of most of the Old Testament. The Psalms were translated into English. There was sort of a flourishing vernacular culture. And then the Normans came, and that kind of ended. So this is one example. Let's go the other way. There we go. So here's another one. This is actually another bilingual Psalter. This is a French one from around 1225 or so. Again, Latin is on this side. French is on this side. So it doesn't matter if you only know, if you can only read French, you'll be able to use this as a prayer source. To just kind of walk through a standard one, this is the Caro Psalter. It's a book written in East Anglia, so kind of the Norwich area. Actually, if you're familiar with Julian of Norwich, who's a mystic of the 13th century, Caro Abbey was the place that she was trained. So it's entirely possible that she might have seen this very book. So what does it have in it? Well, it starts out with a calendar. And so this is a calendar of the saints' days and the various feasts and fasts that show up in the year that would be recognized by how much you eat, how much you don't eat, whether you're going to be going to church on that day, that kind of thing. Then it's got the Psalter in it, so it's going to have all 150 psalms. And there we've got the big initial for Beatus for the beginning of Psalm 1. Then at the end of the Psalter, so once you get through all the psalms, then we have the canticles. So the biblical canticles here, and then after that we have the litany, petitions, and a variety of collects. All right, and so here you can see the litany, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord hear us, O Christ hear us. So it's a litany very similar to probably what you either just did or are going to do shortly. After that, then we have some little offices. So the little offices were versions of the monastic hours that were shortened and trimmed back a bit and didn't have the variety. So that there would be sort of one pattern adapted from a day that would be used. So we have the Office of the Dead, which is prayed twice a day to remember and to pray for the souls of the dead, and then the Hours of the Blessed Virgin. And so those would follow the monastic pattern. So you'd have matins and lauds and prime and terce and sexton known, just like the standard monastic pattern would. And then this one, and then the psalters would always contain other stuff. So the other stuff in this one is the Psalter of the Virgin, which is a devotional writing by St. Bonaventure. So that's the kind of thing that a psalter would have in it. It would have the psalms, it would have the canticles, and then it would have these little offices. So there was a shift. Beginning about the 14th century or so, the books of hours began to take over from the psalters. The advantage here, books of hours are smaller. Right? And one of the reasons why this is a big advantage is because you can carry it around. So women would frequently have a little bag, or there'd be a hook on it, so you could hook it to your belt, so that you could wear it around. And one of the benefits of this, of course, is that other people could see it, because these were very beautiful works frequently, and so it was actually a form of conspicuous consumption to be able to show off just how wealthy you were, that you had a very beautiful little book of hours. So form factor is one of the reasons for the shift here. So they're smaller, they're easier to carry around. There was a little bit less material in them because of the size shift. So they don't usually have the whole Psalms in them anymore. Instead, you'd have a calendar. You'd have the Hours of the Blessed Virgin, Hours of the Cross or the Passion. You'd have the penitential Psalms, and then litanies, suffrages, collects, and a bunch of other prayers. There's no real standardized form of them outside of this because we're dealing with a manuscript culture. So everything gets hand copied. If you want certain stuff in your book of hours, you say, hey, include this stuff in it. And so no two are really exactly alike. But we still have kind of this basic fundamental pattern. That's kind of the key stuff. Most of the illuminated manuscripts that you'll see from the Middle Ages are from the books of hours, which tells you two things. First, that these were pretty books. That's one of the reasons why they survived. Second, these were actually very popular, especially in that Northern Europe area. So here's an example of one. This is from French Flanders, the 15th century, so probably the first quarter, I'd guess, just based on the designs around the edge here. This kind of style was very popular in around 1425. And so here we've got the start of the Hours of the Blessed Virgin. So we've got, O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth shall proclaim your praise. Yet, just like our morning prayer opens. And then we've got here the start of the Office of the Dead. So here are two other pages. This is from a different, this is from a French prayer book. So we have the start of the Hours of the Holy Spirit over there. And then one of the other things that we frequently find, not always, but sometimes, is prayers at Mass. So we've got Latin prayers here, but then we've got little notes here in red that are in French. And so, for instance, this particular note says, when the priest turns away from the people and to begin the preface, then you would say, Here we go. This is the section I was wanting. So during the preface, or when the preface is said, "Holy, holy, holy, Lord God of hosts, heaven and earth are full of your glory," right? So it's the Sanctus and the Benedictus that we're used to hearing. So parts of the Mass then are being included in these private prayers, and then there are additional things. So like when the host is elevated by the priest, then you'd say this way, "Come, Holy Spirit, and fill my heart." So a variety of prayers for use during the service, because the idea is you would have this prayer book, you would pray it with friends or by yourself, and then you'd bring it to church with you. Sometimes then you'd pray some of the hours while the priest was up there doing his thing until it came time for the Eucharist. And then when it came time for the Eucharist, then you'd go and then you'd pray the devotional prayers in your book while the priest and the choir are up there doing their thing. So the book then is how you're doing your thing as a member of the laity. All right, so we start having books of hours in the vernacular. So Gertrud, who's got one of the greatest names in theological history, he's the founder of the Brethren of the Common Life and kicked off the whole Devotio Moderna movement, which was an influence on the start of the Reformation. He invested in a group of the Devotio Moderna when he was young, and part of what spurred him. Thomas à Kempis, his book, The Imitation of Christ, very much comes out of the Devotio Moderna movement. Well, one thing is, even though Gertrud didn't live very long, he only lived to 44, he died of the plague because he was tending the sick who were sick with the plague, and he caught it and died. But one of the things that he did is he translated the books of hours from Latin into Dutch. And so here, this is actually an example from at the Walter. Where it's the hours in the common language, in Dutch. Everything else is the same. Just in a different language. Same kind of thing. Devotions for the Eucharist are over here. The 7 penitential psalms here, all in Dutch. And so this idea of having the books of hours in a vernacular language were not an unusual thing. Around this time, we start seeing people fomenting for the Bible in English. So 1380s or so, we've got Tyndale and his translation of the Bible into English, which is suppressed. All right. Then we get to the Reformation time. So Henry VIII reigns from 1509 to 1557. The political honestly, there's a war going on for the soul of the English. And the chief battlefield was in the primers. So the primers are the printed versions of the books of hours. So, once printing became available, these were no longer deluxe luxury items only for the rich. Instead, we have court cases about a homeless woman who steals the primer of a domestic servant. So that shows you how far they've penetrated into society, that you have a domestic servant who owns one of these, and that a homeless woman is actually interested in stealing it. All right? So the printing of English language primers explodes in the 1530s. And so most of these are imports. So in France, they're printing Catholic ones. In the Low Countries, which the Reformation has happened there, they're printing Protestant ones. And they're all sending them into England to try and influence what it is that the English are praying. All right? So the battle is for how will English people pray? Right, so here's an example of what one of the early printed primers looked like. This is actually from 1557. I couldn't find any good pictures of the earlier ones. And so this is actually from the reign of Mary, Queen Mary. So if you look in here, it's got more standard Roman Catholic prayers. And it's also a bilingual. We've got English here and Latin in the small type over here on the side. Right, but when Henry does his Reformation, when Henry breaks away from the English Church, he declares the official liturgical books in 1545. The official books of the English Church under Henry VIII are the Sarum Missal in Latin, the Sarum Breviary in Latin, and then the King's Primer to be used by the people, which is bilingual. It's in Latin and in English. And so what the Primer has in it is it's got a whole lot of stuff that we're very used to seeing from the books of hours. So it's got a calendar, it's got material prefaces, it's got matins and the little hours, it's got evensong and compline, it's got the 7 penitential psalms, the litany, office for the dead, psalms of the Passion, Passion of our Lord, and then certain godly prayers for sundry purposes. All right? So this is the book that Henry VIII, even though he's very conservative, even though he insists on Mass and office in Latin for the clergy and the monks, who he hasn't dissolved yet. At this point, actually, he'd already dissolved most of them. But the book that he puts into the hands of the people is English, and it contains this kind of material. And then we get printers who print all sorts of unofficial expansions of this, because because these books were so popular, they were actually one of the things you could print that would make money. And so in order to capitalize on this, printers would add extra things that they think people are going to want to have. And so the sorts of things they add are the collects for the Sundays and the holy days in English, the epistles and gospel readings for all the Sundays and holy days in English, vernacular devotions for use in the Mass, and then, of course, more prayers. Right, so these are the things that are being added into what was already there. And I know I'm going through this pretty quickly. So I'm going to stop in a moment and take questions, thoughts, and revisit things. All right, now this is the table of contents of the first Book of Common Prayer. So it's the preface, the calendar, matins, evensong, the collects, epistles, and gospels for Sundays and holy days in English, then the supper of the Lord and Holy Communion, the litany and suffrages, then baptism, confirmation, matrimony, communion of the sick, burial, purification of women, and then notes and directions. And there are also various and sundry prayers that we've got some clustered here, we've got some clustered here as well. So this is the first prayer book. And so the question that I found myself pondering was, how different is this from the King's Primer, especially given the kinds of expansions that were being added into them on a regular basis? Now, what's interesting is that even after, so the first Book of Common Prayer, Henry would not allow a prayer book of the sort that we now have during his lifetime. Because again, he was very conservative, theologically and liturgically. So after he died, 1549, so just like right after, it's 2 years after he dies, that's when the first English Book of Common Prayer comes out. So that's when this appears on the scene. Archbishop Cranbrook and his friends have already been working on this for a while. And then when Edward becomes king, Edward is more open to these ideas. And so we get this book, and then in 1552, they're going to do a revision, which is a much more reformed book, the kind of thing that certainly Henry VIII would never have allowed. And what's also interesting is that King Edward issues a primer in 1553. And so it's got some slightly different things. It's got a calendar, a catechism. It's got an order for private morning prayer and evening prayer, and then proper psalms and lessons, the litany, the collects, certain godly prayers for sundry purposes. So at this point, this is actually kind of a moment of negotiation, where we're trying to figure out, well, what exactly do we have these two different books for? And the chief thing seems to be that this has the order for private morning prayer, whereas the other is the order for public morning and evening prayer. But the primers kind of die out a bit after this point. There are a few that are released in Elizabeth's reign. None of them are official, though, after the 1559 prayer book. Well, I take that back. Mary, I believe, issues some Catholic primers to get the English people praying rightly as far as she's concerned. And then Elizabeth's prayer book comes along. All right, so this has kind of been a big whirlwind tour of these things. So the conventional wisdom is that the Book of Common Prayer is the priest's book. You know, that they've taken their books and kind of cut them down for the consumption of the laity. And while there is a certain truth to that, I think there's a bigger part of the story that it misses. And that's that if we really want to track what's in the prayer book, especially as it occurred and kind of erupted in the Reformation, it's home, taxonomically. So the way that it's shaped, the stuff that's in it, it's much more an amplified primer than it is a cut-down missal and breviary combo. So what this means, theologically and spiritually, is that this isn't about the clergy allowing us to use their books. It's always been our book. And so the heritage of the prayer book is that it's always been the book that the English people prayed from. And that we beefed it up and amplified it to the degree that the clergy can use it to celebrate from. But in its bones, it's kind of always been our book. All right, so let me stop and take questions, thoughts, comments, stuff. Yes?
John, let me give you this one, dear.
Yeah,
oh, sorry.
microphone.
Surprise,
Yep.
good morning.
Can you hear now? Back in the 1500s, what portion of the population could read at that point?
That's a good question. I think
the clergy probably could, and certainly.
So the clergy, most of the clergy could read. Yeah. Most of the clergy could get through Latin text, could get through pronouncing Latin text. The degree to which most of the clergy could understand Latin text is a whole other kettle of fish. There was more literacy among the laity and less among the clergy than is generally supposed. By the time that the printing press really gets introduced and gets going, though, one of the things that makes the printing press grow as a technology is because you had a lot more people you had an emerging middle class, and those people could read. So you had one of the great sort of shifts after the plague comes through in 1350 and following is that you've got a shift. We have kind of an emergence of a middle class, and with that comes literacy. International trade increases after that point, which requires a lot more writing. So regular people have a need to read and write. It's not just the nobles. It's not just the clergy, and so you have a lot more literacy among the laity. And so that's one of the things that actually propelled printing. It kind of went hand in hand. It's not just, oh, we can suddenly print books, so you should learn to read now. Instead, it's, hey, I know how to read. I'd like to buy some of those. And so then the presses could be capitalized, and they could make money. So there was, I can't give you an exact percentage. That's a great question. But it's more than you'd suppose, and especially when it comes to reading in the vernacular. Yes.
Just to pick up on that, and thank you so much for this original research. And I actually think that it's, I'm quite persuaded by it. I think actually what you're doing is an incredible genealogy of the prayer book. So I think you're right to add this fold to the story. And just to pick up on what John was saying, I did research and I published a couple of articles on the formation of English common law. Mm-hmm. And why this is germane is that in the same time period, you would get benefit of clergy, which was proved often by your ability to read.
Yes.
And so you'd get a different treatment in the law court if you could read. And so initially it was clergy and then nobility who would get easier treatment in the law court. And from there, that treatment gets extended to become the jus communis, the common law. Right. And then it becomes its own kind of entity in the 17th century and 18th century. So all of this points to the fact that you have this kind of elaborate dance in England between the authority of the local versus the authority of the metropole.
Right.
And so in some ways, what Roman Catholics would call the principle of subsidiarity is operative in this. And then also vocation is becoming more and more important during that time as well. And what I hear you saying is that the Book of Common Prayer was as much a product of the vocational needs of the laity as it was the clergy.
Yes.
And that's what I think you're adding to this, to the story. Which is that true? Do I have you right? And I'm sorry to complicate things with all the reading thing, but John brought it up, and so I thought I could say something.
Yeah, no, that's correct. That is correct. There was a deep interest and a hunger to encounter this material and for then lay people to put it into practice and to live out their vocation. So yes. So on the law court thing, we're used to there just being a sort of one set of laws across the country. But in the Middle Ages, it was kind of a patchwork of jurisdictions. So you'd have a local court, you'd have the king's court, and then you'd have the church court. And as he said, you can always get off easier in the church court. And so one of the words for literacy in the medieval period was salturatus, meaning you know your psalter. And so frequently the test for whether you could, whether you should not be tried in this jurisdiction is if you could read Psalm 51. And so a lot of folks would memorize then Psalm 51 in Latin so that they could hold up a book and just rattle it off in order to be tried in a different court where they get a more lenient punishment.
Quick question. Puritan scholarship was already beginning to be deeply rooted at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, by 1560.
Right.
How does the Book of Common Prayer relate to the nonconformist report at that time? I mean, I can't get it right in my brain chronologically.
So at this point, so in 1559, right? That's when Elizabeth comes to the throne. So it's no longer Roman Catholic. The Puritans have been in and around and at work since before the 1530s, and they've been circulating materials actively during that time. That's one of the reasons for the insistence on tracking, so how one practiced one's religion was related to how one was offering authority to the king. And so conformity, whether you were going to services where the Book of Common Prayer was used, was an important measure of that for folks on both ends, both the Catholic end of the spectrum and the Protestant Radical Reformation or Puritan side of it. And so because they insisted on conformity, the act of conformity was the act that said you have to go to church and use the prayer book. So the whole idea of nonconformity to those services, and you would be fined for that, and you could be jailed for that. And so there was a negotiation for a while about how far they were willing to sit with the book. And different folks, I guess, came down to different places there. I don't know that piece of it, of the history, as well as I'd like. My roots are in the earlier centuries, really. So I can't fully answer that, but certainly it was, that was a building clash. And it was something that was going to build and take on much more energy until the English Civil War, when, of course, the Puritan sides took over and outlawed the Book of Common Prayer, which is a whole other story. Yeah. Other questions, thoughts, comments, anything?
I just wondered if the printing and versions and dissemination of the written was partly to marshal the clergy by Henry VIII. Here's the way we're going to do it. Mm-hmm. Kind of Was there any enforcement in terms of, you know, Henry VIII and the church then saying, okay, we've made a break, here's the way we're going to pray, and now we want to make sure that you are, like you said in the beginning, that it had to do with how you practice, how you perform in public.
Right.
And I've heard, you know, anecdotally regarding other churches, this notion of, even in the modern day, of, you know, enforcement of ritual and practices. So I wondered if they must have been quite instrumental in forging the change.
Right. So one of the key mechanisms you'd use for this is the bishop's visitation. And so there were articles of visitation for the bishops. So these are, as the bishop goes around and visits his various parishes, these are the things he's supposed to look for. Things that they're supposed to have, things that they're not supposed to have. And then to check up on how the service is being done. So yeah, that's one of our sources for what's actually kind of going on the ground, is looking at the visitation articles, because these tell us, they tell us a variety of things. They tell us that they give us a range of possibilities of what sort of things might be happening. They also tell us what things the authorities are afraid might be happening. And so sometimes they give us information about what is going on that people either like or don't like. But sometimes they also let us know what it is that they're afraid is going to happen or not happen.
I think we have time for one more question.
I'm interested in hearing how, when we split from Britain, that we got our own prayer book, which is the same but different.
Right. Yeah. So, at this point, the 1662 prayer book was the standard, because after the English Civil War, they essentially decided to mostly ratify what was back in the 1559. So that was sort of a real move of continuity. And so when a lot of the early American foundations started using the 1662 prayer book. Once the revolution happened, though, that was not going to work for us. It had the prayers for the king and that sort of thing in it. There were questions about what we ought to do. There were some draft proposals circulated. There was a draft that I think went around, I want to say 1763. There was a draft. It was kind of wacky. It did some unusual things. So our 1789 is also a little unusual in ways that we decide to pick certain psalms, do certain offices. But we did decide to keep going as a church, and we needed to get ourselves some bishops then, because we could not get bishops. English bishops to consecrate American bishops, of course, nor would English bishops consecrate American bishops, because a part of the 1662 ceremony for consecrating a bishop is swearing the oath to the king. And so an American bishop is not going to swear an oath to the king. So they simply couldn't do that. And so that's where our Scottish cousins helped us out. This is why we're the Episcopal Church, is because we have the Episcopal Church of Scotland. And so the Scottish bishop said, okay, we will consecrate you, but we really like our form of the Eucharistic prayers better, so you need to use ours. And so we have a Scottish version, is what we inherited into the 1789 Book of Common Prayer. So it's sort of a hybrid of the 1662 combined with some American kind of Enlightenment changes, and then some Scottish additions. So it certainly stands within the trajectory of the English Books of Common Prayer, but with some interesting changes.
Well, I think it is for us to wrap up this segment of the Book of Common Prayer and go on to our future segment of the Book of Common Prayer at Worship. But please thank Derek Olson for us. And join us back here after church for lunch and for keeping Lent with the prayer book as it is now, if God has that on your schedule today. Thank you so much for being here.